Okay, so the question I'm asking today, is there a role for diet in treating OCD or preventing OCD? And I'll tell you the answer, possibly, but needs lots more evidence. But there's lots of little signals, lots of little things around it that I think it certainly suggests it's worth investigating. So I'm going to try and talk today about the context, and particularly in the context of lifestyle and what's happened to the Western diet. I'm going to talk about the gut microbiota, some of the evidence for dietary interventions for mental disorder in general, and, you know, look, really emphasise here, look, there's no evidence that diet alone can treat OCD. Don't give up on standard treatments. This is very much a planned research. So, I'm co-editing a book at the moment on lifestyle, psychiatry and psychology. I'm trying a practical book at the moment. And it's essentially, we primary care and GPs have done quite a lot of sort of lifestyle medicine for a while. And so what we're really trying to focus on is now lifestyle for psychiatry and psychology, evidence-based discipline which aims to support people to prevent, manage and reverse mental disorder and physical conditions. So the focus is going to be here on the mental disorder, and physical conditions is like a byproduct, a secondary benefit. And we're going to be using behaviour change skills and techniques to create and sustain lifestyle adjustments. It's really rooted in the psychology of habit change, because one of the problems, as you'll see, is actually the difficulties in unlearning habits and relearning new habits. I'm just going to make a mention to an rest in peace for Michael Mosley, who was a lot of the inspiration behind this. And he was someone I graduated with at medical school, and I kept occasional contact with him, and it was really sad hearing about his death on that Greek island. So, when we talk about lifestyle, they usually talk about 6 different pillars. And so particularly in terms of improving sleep, we're going to be talking mainly about improving diet today, improving activity, in terms of rest and connection with oneself, connecting with others, the social connections, and reducing substances and alcohol. Underneath it all, you can think about connecting with nature and using environmental benefits. And across the top, we can think about public mental health, because a lot of the things that could be done could be supported by government changes, law changes, and nudges to help clinicians and to help individuals make these sorts of differences. It does have some evidence for prevention and treatment. So if you want to have a look at a good paper, the Australians, I have to say, are very much in the advance here. They've been doing a lot of this basic research so far, and a lot of it is mainly focused on activity, reducing substances, improving diet, and improving sleep. And the most of the evidence is mainly on depression, a little less on anxiety, ADHD, as you can see, and psychotic disorders, but most of it's mainly on depression. And a little bit on OCD. I think you actually already referred to it. This is the little meta-analysis that Naomi was involved with. And you can see actually the conclusion of most meta-analyses is that, well, look, yes, there is some benefit, but few trials were of robust quality and all risk of bias. That's a conclusion virtually of all meta-analyses. What's the mechanism, though? I don't know whether it's just because you're being activated and doing more. It's similar for depression. It doesn't seem to be anything to do with getting fitter, but being active. And we did that. My first RCT was actually getting people with on Hampstead Heath running when they're depressed. But it was no different from actually just getting them to be active with a different type of exercise. The problem is, and across all these different lifestyle interventions, is how do you get people to adhere regularly, and what sort of support do you need to get people to do this sort of stuff? And, well, in this case, how often do you exercise? I find it difficult enough to exercise. I have to incorporate it into my lifestyle by cycling to work and things like this. Get me to go out and go for a run or something. You just won't do it. So it's really tough to change behaviour. These are habits. So the only stuff I could find so far on diet is a study really not in people with OCD, but let's say subclinical mild OCD, because they were using a measure called the obsessive compulsive inventory in the general population. And so they would be regarded as having very mild OCD. But they did find over a 3-month period that lower vegetable and oily fish intake and lower moderate intensity and physical activity predicted higher OCD symptoms at follow-up. And higher intake of high-fat foods predicted higher compulsive behaviours at follow-up. Obviously, you need to replicate this in a clinical population, and the problem often is diet is difficult to assess. People generally tend to underestimate the junk and the crap that they are eating, or the amount that they're eating. Probably it's the best to actually help people to photograph every single piece of food or plate that they're eating just over 2 or 3 days to make that assessment. But it is difficult, if you get people to try and just do a simple diet activity, it's very difficult to know how accurate it is. So let's just think broadly, first of all. There have been massive changes, dietary changes in the last century. Everything, it used to all be in the home, it's gone to the factory. We went from whole food to a lot more ultra-processed foods, adding sugar, refined carbohydrates, animal to vegetable fats, omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids, grass to grain-fed animals, and lots of new molecules have been added to our foods, food dyes, preservatives, trans fats. And all these things have had the advantage of making them cheap and making them last long. If you have got a piece of cheese that you have left out for a week and it has not grown any bacteria on it, you've got to be worried about it because it's a pretty processed cheese. Yeah, growing bacteria on the cheese is good. And things like soda, sugar, it's correlated with poor mental health. In terms of the amount that you're drinking, increased aggression, violence. I haven't talked a lot about mechanisms. This seems to be particularly through increased inflammation, inflammatory markers and so on associated. But it's if you look at the amount of US, here in this case, US sugar consumption, it just keeps going up. Occasionally it goes down a bit. But, our diet is just so sugar amongst it. And also there's been a change from omega-3 to omega-6. Omega-3 is your good fatty acids. That's the ones required for the brain. And it's just changed again. So if you look at the body fats, in amount of omega-6, it's again, in US body fat, I'm sure it's the same in the UK, it just keeps going up. So in general, healthy diet patterns and depression in this large study, in general, if you look at the diets of individuals with depression and healthy diets tend to be associated with less depressive symptoms. Unhealthy diets were particularly ultra-processed foods, added sugar, refined grains. And you'll see, we'll talk about a little bit later on, healthy diets is mainly lots of vegetables, fruits, legumes, whole grains, nuts, fish, lean meats, and olive oil. That was in these sorts of studies. So we'll be talking about what the ideal diet is a bit later on. And they've also looked at that in adolescence and depression. And people would say, well, isn't it because when you get depressed that your eating becomes poorer? But what they were able to demonstrate in this follow-up was that there was no reverse causality. Yes, as you get depressed, you eat less well, but it was able to predict beforehand that if you're in the lowest quality diet, much more likely to get depressed prospectively. So particularly, if you look at adolescents' diet these days, it is awful. And so we've been talking mainly about diet and disordered eating in depression and other conditions. I mean, there's a whole, I know people are doing PhDs on this one, disordered eating in OCD. And you can probably think of many different examples. So things like avoiding food which is contaminated, they're only eating food sealed in a package, i.e. they're going to be eating junk food. Someone else who might be fearing that blurting out obscenities, so they keep their mouth closed all the time, and so they're restricting the amount they're eating. Someone else who might be and restricting the types of fibrous food. All these things are unhelpful and actually make your OCD worse. And so what we've got as a story often is self-neglect. Because of the compulsions, you've got no time to eat. When people with OCD have a very low BMI, they get taken to an eating disorders unit. And in my experience, they don't do very well because the OCD is not treated and the patient just feels very misunderstood. We know that there's a lot of comorbidity with autistic spectrum. And I'm not an expert in this, but you tend to see a very bland, restricted diet. And that may be for sensory reasons and all sorts of other things. And then at the other end of the service, there are people with disordered eating or frank anorexia who then get excluded from CBT until they reach a certain BMI. We're certainly questioning that, and we're trying to do a current case series of individuals with low BMI and having CBT. And it does take longer, it seems, but it shouldn't probably exclude people. Now, if you want to follow a healthy diet, it's really tough. If let's go down to the supermarket after this, and you'll be blinded with lots of stuff, isn't it, telling you about how to eat healthily. Fat-free, whole grain, immune support, made with real fruit. I mean, there's a lot of obfuscation by industry in order to make us eat this stuff. In general, if something is saying something, it's usually not. I mean, think of things like the Democratic Republic of South Korea or something. I mean, the point is it's not democratic and it's not a People's Republic. But, in general, and you can come up, I'm trying to think of lots. I once went to a solicitor's for buying a home abroad, and they were called legal independents. Now, I should have known that they were not independent from the builders, It's like this, obfuscation. So here's the problem, guys. We got a problem where industry has made it cheap, but probably eating more. We've got poor support by the government for public health, lots of conflicting dietary guidelines, out of date and not optimized for mental health. In general, you go and send goes to the dietitian, they're focusing on increasing or losing weight rather than necessarily eating healthy foods. And I would recommend, there was a very nice little documentary on Monday, I think it's still on iPlayer, by Chris Van Tulleken, who's one of the researchers, academics at UCL. And he's brought together a lot of interesting information on ultra-processed food. Of course, we've talked about how they're convenient, cheap, and energy dense. They take up now about 50%, sometimes 60, 70% of the diet. And essentially, there are ingredients you wouldn't usually have at home. Preservatives, colouring, sweeteners, emulsifiers, usually added sugars and fats. So, there was lots of examples today, in your today. Industrialised bread, many pre-packaged meals, breakfast cereals, sausages, reconstituted meats, sweets, pastries, packaged cakes and biscuits, energy drinks, packaged meat pastries like, pies and pasties. All sorts of potential problems, obesity, physical and mental health associations. One very nice randomized controlled trial in which they were put on a very controlled way in the laboratory on either eating ultra-processed diet or an unprocessed diet. And this was just over 2 weeks randomized to one or the other. And they were matched for the amount of, on the plates, the provided calories, sugar, fat, fiber, and macronutrients. Absolutely totally matched. But if you're having the ultra-processed diet, you were much more likely to gain weight even over those 2 weeks compared to the ordinary unprocessed diet. So, this was the first evidence that it's not just, your just your proteins and carbohydrates or whatever. It really is the way the food is prepared as well. How else can we do this? So there is a couple of good trials now in depression. So again, the Australians are ahead. They've done 2 trials on adults with depression. This is the first one, the SMILES trial, and the person who led this was Felice Jacka. And they're able to demonstrate that just eating healthily, a healthy diet with a support, was doing better than the social support group. And that was also replicated by another Australian group, and they were able to demonstrate again that exactly the same findings and what a healthy diet should be. So what a lot of people is now focusing on is what is going on in the brain, the second brain, which is the gut microbiota. So the gut microbiota is about 200 trillion bacteria, phages, viruses in your lower gut. And you can describe it as a sort of pharmacy, producing thousands of chemical metabolites that influence the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and the vagus nerve back up to the brain. Because we always used to think of as, just the brain influencing the gut and things like irritable bowel and so on, but it goes both ways. And there are early reports of changes in the microbiota and OCD, there's a little paper up there, and a whole range of other mental disorders, but there's nothing clear that's coming out at the moment. Its the first 3 years of life are especially important. Even things like a vaginal birth seems to be influencing the nature of your gut microbiota. But in general, it's influenced by your antibiotics, emulsifiers, preservatives, artificial sweeteners, poor sleep, and a diet, especially how much fibre in your diet. Tim Spector has been leading a lot of this work at KCL, and it's lovely the way he talks about putting his own son on a Big Mac diet for 10 days and managed to lose 40% of the microbiota diversity. They have demonstrated in their twin studies a lot of influence from, especially in obesity, diabetes, hypertension, allergies. These are identical twins, but different, differences in the gut microbiota. But, depression and anxiety were in the middle. They weren't as strong as obesity and diabetes, but they were definitely influenced by the microbiota. Things like fasting, there's a lot of interesting things like trying to increase your gap between meals. It seems to improve recovery in your gut, and up to 13, 14-hour gap improves that microbiota diversity as well. I was wondering whether to put this next slide into this audience, but fecal transplants have provided of interest. I don't think it's going to catch on in the OCD community. So they have demonstrated, they've transplanted fecal microbiota from depressed patients and matched controls into rats, and the rats that received the transplants from the depressed patients developed behavioural and physiological features characteristic of depression and anxiety-like behaviours and alterations in tryptophan metabolism. This has also been replicated in obesity. You can do fecal transplants from healthy humans, as it were, and it's actually even used in the NHS for particularly difficult to treat Clostridium difficile through a nasogastric tube or up your rectum. And there are case reports of transplants for treating depression, alopecia, and so on this way as well. So there are some private clinics that I've noticed have caught on to this. They're not regulated, or even people sort of do internet searches. Again, I wouldn't recommend on how to do it. As I said, I can't see fecal transplants for OCD catching on. If you've got a sort of fear of contamination and you think you're going to have this fecal transplant, I'm not convinced, but maybe in 10 years it'll be available. I'm very inspired by what I suppose my predecessor, who at our Bethlehem Royal Hospital where I'm based, there was a Dr. George Porter Phillips, and he first published in 1910 on using a probiotic, a lactobacillus, for treatment of mediconia. And even more fun we had was we found that he was the president of the Bethlehem Staff Dining Club. And it was actually the 100th anniversary where we were able to then launch a pizza in his name. So we're very much carrying on this tradition. So back to the gut microbiota, most people now believe that a lot of your diet is of limited or no benefit to the microbiota in the lower gut. Most of it, specifically of refined carbohydrates, is already absorbed in the upper part of the tract, and what eventually reaches the large intestine is of limited value, as it contains only small amounts of minerals, vitamins, and other nutrients necessary for maintenance of the microbiota. So it's primarily about the problems is to do with fibre. We've tried to implement that at our anxiety disorders residential unit at the Bethlehem Royal, where we've opened a guts cafe. We've got an allotment to grow our food, and our goal is to improve cooking, hospitality skills, enhance exposure, and improve the gut microbiota of hospital staff and patients. We had a commercial oven, a pizza oven donated. They get our residents get training in sourdough baking and barista coffee making. It's now open for hospital staff and patients. I would love to make it the whole unit more independent from the hospital caterers, but that requires a lot of demonstration first to our management that we could actually do that. So what is an ideal diet? There is a bit of a tension here. And as I said, I apologise that in the transfer of the slides, they've all seemed to have changed. I noticed that there was a First World Congress of nutritional psychiatry a few years ago, and there was a tension between those people who were focusing on the sort of ideal diet and those who were trying to focus on nutraceuticals. That is the idea that you could perhaps just add some certain probiotics or whatever and then sort out a particular problem. My view is that you do have to do this in the context of a whole load, not just an ideal diet, but in the context of other lifestyle changes. And it may be that for some people, actually, we need to focus on their diet and their activity levels, but for someone else, it's much more to do with connection with others and being able to perhaps connect with nature or whatever it is. But the point is that it's the diet here people we're trying to focus on. So here's your ideal diet. Is it diverse? Yeah, minimum of 30 types of plants, nuts, and seeds weekly. That's something you can count up. Are you having some fermented foods, what we call the probiotics? So this is your kefir, your kimchi, sauerkraut, miso, tempeh, live yogurts, and cheeses. You know, this is the good things keep topping up your fermented foods. Fibrous foods, this is the prebiotics, that is the foods for your bacteria. So high ones are things like artichoke, they're not called fartichokes for a particular reason, asparagus, brassicas, spinach, kale, dandelion, greens, garlic, leeks, onions, beans, whole wheats, barley oats, bran, banana, apples, cocoa. In general, raw is better than cooked. Plenty of good oily fish, walnuts and flaxseed for omega-3. Sourdough bread, whole grain. I use a meadow blend, which has got 10 different flours, and then we add about 10 different seeds, and I cook that every 2 weeks. And then you can see, if you're a very good friend of mine, you'll get a little brown paper bag with my brand, which is Cognitive Crusts. And you can see, actually, this is actually my daughter who made it up for me. But you can see what she did. She sucked it through the artificial intelligence and got a brain on one side and a loaf on the other. So it's a bit of a joke in my family. But no, a good, crusty sourdough bread, nice and fibrous. Actually, I managed to get 20 different stuff in for the whole week just by a slice of bread. Plenty of polyphenols. It's all about eating the rainbow, isn't it? Berries, pomegranates, chocolates. You could train yourself to have 85% cocoa or more. 100% is ideal. Glass of wine, optional. Avoiding the ultra-processed foods. Yes, it is probably more expensive. Not necessarily, but it is difficult. And, the question is, whose role is it going to be to try to help support people? This is something really, I think, to help people from an early age. This is something for schools, to be able to eating healthily and, personalising your diet as well. So one of the things that's been, the people who've been personalising it most is the Zoe app. And this is partly based at KCL. It's a personalised dietary programme. What you do if you do it, it is a little expensive. You have a standardised muffin they give you, and then you measure your response for blood glucose, your serum lipids, a little blood test, and the fecal sample. And you get back a very detailed report and recommendations of foods that you should be perhaps avoiding, really. So something like white bread is scored about 0, and your avocado is scored about 100. So I found that when I did it, I don't respond very well to my glucose. I'm not diabetic, but I'm still subclinical compared. If you compare yourself to another 10,000 people, my serum lipids again is not that good, but my poo is perfect because it helps to compensate in all these different things. Yeah, but here's I'll show you mine if you show me yours. Yes. So, what is this all leading up to? What is it all leading up? So the question I have is this Zoe app, or just eating a healthy diet, a personalised diet program, is there any benefit in OCD? Well, it's still at a planning stage, and the tediousness of ethics and all the other things. We're going to be using a single case experimental design, and both in OCD and BDD, on people who are in a waiting list. Or, we're using clinical individuals. I like single case experimental designs because, one, if you're doing a big RCT, it costs millions of pounds, and they're really only answering the question, is treatment A on average more effective than treatment B or whatever? Here, they cost much cheaper, and you're really acting as your own control in terms of, is this particular intervention helpful for you compared to another intervention? And you then replicate it in the next person, and then you can do a meta-analysis of all these individuals doing it. So we're asking, is this personalised dietary intervention more effective than a standard diet over 12 weeks for symptoms of OCD and depression? And you can have a multiple baseline, randomised to starting the different phases, and so on. So I'm hoping that we're going to be able to get that off the ground very shortly. And it's really just let's just see what happens, because it looks interesting, yeah? And happy to discuss things. Oh, just a quick plug for my band. We're playing on Friday at the Water Rats in London, Bedlam. And Bedlam, of course, is the home of our museum, the Bethlehem Museum of Madness, down at the Bethlehem as well. Great. Thank you.